Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 1. The topic for today's discussion is the nation state in the age of the global economy. We all know that the whole idea of globalization verges on the issue of intensification of worldwide interconnectedness. And the central issue in this borderless world is whether the nation state has been eclipsed or not. And the debate verges in large measure on the role of the state regarding a minimal or a maximal role. Let us establish the context briefly. Does globalization imply a minimalist state? Barry comments that the rationale of the minimalist state usually derives negatively from an economic critique of the extensive state. For despite the collapse of communism and the move towards free markets throughout the world, we still live in societies that are significantly statist. The state can hardly be denied. In fact, most Western capitalist countries have large public sectors, many of whom spend up to 50% of their gross domestic products. America and Japan spend about 35%. The United Kingdom spends about 42%, expenses having been as low as 37% in the 1980s. Extensive privatization has seen the state withdraw from the economy in goods and services, but it is still a huge player in welfare activities, particularly when it comes to education and health. Sometimes the state has been found to be a supplier in these fields, but most states allow competition with private agencies. However, remarkable as the fact is, it is seen that the state has been a facilitator of growth. The well-discussed East Asian experience of state-business relationship in determining economic growth and development tells us a completely different story where the state's developmental role is evident rather than a predatory one. Amsden records the spectacular story of the growth and development and industrialization that has taken place in South Korea and the role that the state has played in that growth story. So the interesting question is, what have been the various responses regarding the state's role in an age of globalization? We generally come across three broad categories. We have the hyper-globalists who are positive about the reality of globalization. We have the skeptics who are not so positive, and in between the two we have the transformationalists. The rise of globalization has stimulated a major debate about the power and significance of the state in a globalized world. In the first place, there are some theorists who have boldly proclaimed the emergence of post-sovereign governance, and they would like to de-emphasize the role of the state by suggesting the rise of globalization, and that is inevitably marked by the decline of the state as a meaningful actor. In the most extreme version of this argument, advanced by the so-called hyper-globalists, the state is seen to have hollowed out as to have become, in effect, redundant, quite eclipsed in a world where borders have become permeable. On the other hand, we have the realists, the skeptics, who tell us a different story, and they tend to deny that globalization has altered the essential contours of world politics, which is that, as in earlier eras, sovereign states continue to be the primary determinants of what goes on inside the borders and remain the principal actors of the world stage. The state, therefore, is here to stay, and the world is definitely state-centric. In between these two views, we have the transformationalists who have a third position which acknowledges that globalization has brought about a qualitative change in the role and the significance of the state and in the nature of sovereignty, but this view emphasizes that these have transformed the state rather than simply reduced or increased its power. So the whole issue is not whether the state has declined or whether the state has become more important. The whole issue is concentrating on the nature of the change that has befallen the state. It is difficult to argue, in fact, that the state and sovereignty have been unaffected by the forces of globalization. This particularly applies in the case of the territorial jurisdiction of the state. The whole idea of sovereignty seems to have got a redefinition. That is because although we keep referring to borderless world in the context of globalization and we talk of permeable borders, the fact remains that multilateral governance have ushered in, and as a result of this, states across the world are often seen to fine-tune their policies and their decisions in sync with global trends and global currents. And that is why it has become commonplace to talk about multilateral governance. The traditional theory of sovereignty was based on the idea that states had supreme control over what took place within their borders, implying that they controlled what crossed their borders. However, developments such as international migration and the spread of cultural globalization have tended to make the state borders increasingly permeable and porous. This can be seen in the growth of cross-border communications and information flows. For instance, radio, satellite television, mobile telephones, and the internet, which occur at an unprecedented speed and in quantities that defy the capacity of the state to detect them, still less effectively control them. And in this context, it would be pertinent to talk about economic globalization and the rise of supra-territoriality. Most of the discussion about the changing nature and power of the state has nevertheless concerned the impact of economic globalization. I was a moment ago talking about multilateral governance. Say, for instance, with the onset of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, it seems that they have emerged as the bandmasters of the global world, and they are the ones who set the tune of what is going to be accepted and echoed by countries across the world. One of the central features of economic globalization is the rise of supra-territoriality, which is reflected in the declining importance of territorial locations, geographical locations, and state borders. An increasing range of economic activities take place within a borderless world, an idea that was flagged by Kenichi Omaya in 1990. If borders have become permeable and all geographical certainties have been given a jolt, state sovereignty, at least in its traditional sense, cannot survive. This in the sense in which governance in the 21st century has assumed a genuinely post-sovereign character. So the question is, can economic sovereignty be reconciled with a globalized economy? On the face of it, it seems that economic sovereignty cannot be reconciled with a globalized economy. I was just referring to the Bretton Woods institutions and their ascendant role in setting global trends and currents to which all countries across the world are having to play second fiddle. India, for instance, in the post-1980 era, and particularly in the post-1990 decade, was seen to liberalize her economy in sync with such global currents. And that is an example of what I'm talking about as the ascendancy of multilateral governance worldwide. It is difficult in particular to see how economic sovereignty can be reconciled with a globalized economy. Sovereign control over economic life was only possible in a world of discrete national economies. The tendencies of national economies to be incorporated to a greater or lesser extent into a globalized economy renders economic sovereignty quite redundant. As Susan Strange puts it, where states were once masters of markets, now it is the markets which on many issues are the masters over the governments of so-called independent and sovereign states. However, this should not allow us to jump to the conclusion that the state has become eclipsed in a globalized world. There is a growing recognition that market-based economies can only operate effectively within a context of legal and social order that only the state and only the state can provide. Moreover, although the states, when acting separately, may have a diminished capacity to control transnational economic activity, they retain the facility to do so through macro frameworks of economic regulation as provided by the G20, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund, or even the World Bank. In other words, it is the states which have to adopt their economies to these global players. So the question is, how has the power and significance of the state been affected by the process of political globalization? We see that in case of economic globalization, clearly multilateral governance has come to the forefront and states are having to tune themselves to global currents. So it's a transformed role. The state has not entirely eclipsed, but they have to also take into consideration global trends and currents. Now, what is the reality at the level of political globalization? There are indeed, let us clarify at the outset, contradictory developments. The power and significance of the state has undoubtedly been affected by the process of political globalization. However, its impact has been complex and in some ways contradictory. On the one hand, you will see that there are international bodies like the United Nations, the European Union, the NATO. They have undermined the capacity of states to operate as exclusively self-governing units. It is clear, for instance, that membership EU threatens state power because a growing range of decisions, for example, decisions pertaining to monetary policies, agricultural and fisheries policies, and the movements of goods and people across the European Union are made by European institutions rather than exclusively by member states. And the second important thing is that the range and importance of these decisions that are made at an intergovernmental or supranational level has nevertheless undoubtedly increased, forcing states to exert influence through regional or global bodies or to operate within frameworks established by them. So at the level of political globalization, we see in one sense that supra-territorial organizations have started exhibiting an increasingly important role, and states are having to play second fiddle to those policies and decisions. However, one must also be conscious of the role that the states play even in this transformed or changed situation. And in this context, I would like to harp on the notion of pooled sovereignty. On the one hand, globalization politically opens up opportunities for the state, but it also diminishes them. Working through international organization and regimes may expand the capacities of the state, allowing them to continue to exert their influence within a globalized and interconnected world. This occurs when states pool their sovereignty. The notion of pooled sovereignty has been most explicitly developed in relation to organizations like the European Union, but could just as well be applied to any other international organization, say for instance the United Nations. By pooling sovereignty, member states transfer certain powers from national governments to European Union institutions or any other global agency, thereby gaining access to a larger and more meaningful form of sovereignty. This is also because, if you reflect, that contemporary problems have surfaced of such nature, like terrorism, like environment, like climate change, which are real problems facing states. But no state is in a position to address these problems single-handedly. And that is why they feel it is more convenient and worthy to try and hold hands together with other nation states in international fora to address these problems in a more concerted way. An interesting question to address at this juncture would be, how has the role of the state got transformed over the years? Globalizing tendencies have not only cast doubt over the continued relevance of the principle of state sovereignty, but has also arguably reshaped the nature of the state itself, a phenomenon which we keep referring to as the gradual evolution, you could even say the transformation that has taken place with reference to the nation state. You know that the nation state was given official recognition to for the first time in 1648 by the Treaty of Westphalia, and thereafter we have seen various models. As a historical institution, in fact, the state has undergone a variety of transformations. For much of the 20th century, the state was characterized by its expanding social and economic role. The most extreme example of this was the development of collectivized states, what we have seen in the context of the socialist world, which attempted to bring the entirety of economic life under state control. So ever since the birth of the Soviet Union in 1917, we have been very clearly exposed to the model of a collectivized or a socialist state. And the best example of such states are represented by the case of the orthodox communist countries, which were always looking up to the erstwhile Soviet Union as their big brother. And this has happened all through Eastern Europe, which is clearly the constituents of the socialist world. Thereafter, we have also seen on the other side the welfare states. States in the capitalist countries nevertheless also demonstrated a marked tendency towards economic and social intervention, albeit of a more modest kind, not as extreme as the socialist version in Eastern Europe or in the erstwhile Soviet Union, but definitely here also we find that the state is acknowledging its role in terms of a welfare agency to cater to certain basic needs for the population, particularly to maintain a subsistence level in the economy. In their case, this involves the adoption of Keynesian strategies of economic management and a strengthening of social protection, leading to the development of what we are familiar with as the welfare state. The ability to deliver prosperity and to protect citizens from social deprivation thus became the principal source of legitimacy in most states. In fact, there are various sections of the population who could not fend for themselves, and they could surely not be looked upon as casualties of civilization, and the state acknowledged its responsibility to look after these people, at least in terms of their basic needs of subsistence. But whether you look at the socialist state of the Eastern European variety or you look at the welfare states of the Western world, we see gradually a phenomenon that has been identified as the hollowing out of the state since the 1980s. Since the 1980s, many commentators have drawn attention to the progressive hollowing out or eclipse of the state, giving rise allegedly to a new form of state. This has been variously described as the competition state, the market state, or the postmodern state. The most common explanation for this has been the changed relationship between the state and the market that has been brought about by the pressures generated by economic globalization, a phenomenon which we have seen just a while ago. This is reflected in the general trend towards neoliberalism, most dramatically demonstrated by the transition from the collectivized to the market-based economies in former communist countries during the 1990s. But it was also evident to some degree across the globe through the adoption of policies of privatization, deregulation, and the rollback of welfare provisions. In fact, after the decline of the Soviet Union and the so-called victory of the Western liberal capitalist model of development, it seems across the world the neoliberal creed has become dominant, whereby states are increasingly leaving more and more space to the private players and are trying to introduce deregulations, various kinds of rolling back on part of the state. But it would be not correct to infer from this development that the state has completely disappeared. In fact, it would be more appropriate to say that we are witnessing a different but not really a reduced state. The changed relationship between markets and states may not simply mean a reduced role for the state, but rather a different role for the state. The state, in this sense, has got transformed, but not eclipsed altogether. Robert Cox has argued that the growing global organization of production and finance has transformed conventional conceptions of government and society, leading to a phenomenon that is called internationalization of the state. Therefore, it is time for us to address frontally the interesting question, what exactly do we mean by internationalization of the state? This is the process. When we refer to internationalization, we refer to a process whereby national institutions, policies, and practices become little more than an instrument for restructuring national economies in line with the dynamics of the global capitalist economy. Although this implies that the state has lost substantial power over the economy, the process of economic globalization nevertheless requires a political framework that is provided by the state, notably in the form of the military territorial power of an enforcer. So let us try to understand the point clearly. You see, the state has tried to, over the years, particularly in the post-socialist framework that we are talking about, after the demise of the erstwhile Soviet Union, the state has decided to give more and more space to private players. But for private players to make it big, it is important that the state also becomes a facilitator. The state has to provide certain basic frameworks in which the private players can indulge in the kind of enterprises that are potent in them. In the modern global economy, this role has largely been assumed by the USA. Bob Jessup described the advent of a more market-oriented states in terms of a move away from the Keynesian welfare nation state towards what he called the Schumpeterian competition state. And this is the kind of state that we see in the world today. So what is the competition state? The competition state is a state that aims to secure economic growth within its borders by securing competitive advantages in the wider global economy. Although they attempt to increase market responsiveness by promoting entrepreneurialism and labor flexibility, competition states are also aware of the need to combat social exclusion and bolster the moral foundations of society. Thus, globalization does not mean an eclipse of the state. This is the point I would like to harp on once more. You see, with the emergence of the competition state, with the emergence of the state in a globalized world, we can see unmistakably a withdrawal of the state from various traditional domains. Okay, there has unquestionably been a rollout of some kind of a rolling back, you can say, of various kinds of welfare activities which were characteristic of the pre-globalization era. But although the state has withdrawn in certain senses from various traditional domains and has given a lot of space to private players, it is not turning a blind eye to the needs of those sections of the population which could be in a position not to be able to utilize the opportunities unleashed by globalization. Therefore, it is not an amoral state. The state is still conscious of its moral responsibilities, particularly with reference to those sections of the population which may not be in a position to take advantage of the opportunities offered in a globalizing world. And that is exactly what we mean by a competition state, and that is why the clarification that the state is not oblivious to its responsibility of combating social exclusion, nor is it indifferent to the needs of those sections of the population who could be unable to take advantage of the opportunities provided by economic globalization. That is why we realize that the state recognizes that globalization does not unfold on a level playing field. Globalization approximates the idea of a borderless world, and with the onset of the WTO regime, countries like India have sought to align themselves with the global currents of liberalization and privatization in the hope that such alignment would create more opportunities and open up more avenues for economic growth and development, particularly of players who have entrepreneurial skills. And in that sense, I have kept on harping on the fact that the state is trying to give more space to private players. More specifically, with the dawning of the liberalization age in the post-1980 period, countries like India, and India is a prominent example in this respect, has witnessed a spate of institutional reforms seeking to liberalize the economy by weeding out outmoded institutions like the licensing system and various closures on trade. In India, you will appreciate that with the 1990s, we found the dismantling of the license Raj and the opening up of the liberalized economy, the age of economic reforms as is commonly referred to. This opening up of the economy to private players is testified by various policy changes and legislations enunciated by the government of India. So in case of India, you will find various policies coming up like the foreign trade policy. India did not have a foreign trade policy, in fact, in the license Raj. And all these started happening in the liberalization era, and countries across the world were trying to set sail to the winds of globalization that were ushered in by the global players like the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF, which constituted the economic apparatus of economic globalization. But the state has, in this situation, not really eclipsed itself. It has found itself saddled with various responsibilities, primarily as an agent of institutional change. While at one level, these institutional changes did open up opportunities for economic growth and development, there are crucial loopholes which need to be addressed. For even where growth and development did occur, they did not necessarily accrue to all stakeholders, and particularly those in the bottom rung of the population. In other words, growth was not necessarily inclusive growth. And for addressing the plight of these sections, the state needs to play a vital and a supportive role, ensuring that these people develop the ability and competence to utilize favorably or take advantage of the opportunities ushered in by globalization, a phenomenon which we commonly refer to as capacity building. The state is clearly required to foster institutional changes that will enhance the ability of the stakeholders involved in various trades and livelihood activities, like, say, for instance, there are cultivators, there are handloom weavers, just to mention some examples, by way of conferring greater security and bargaining power on them, thereby helping them with the ability to cope with an increasingly changing and a more competitive environment. In other words, withdrawing from the traditional domains, giving more space to private players, does not mean an eclipse of the responsibilities which the state and the state alone can shoulder. And this particularly pertains to its responsibility vis-a-vis those sections of the population who are not in a position to take advantage of the opportunities unleashed by globalization. And that is why the important clarification that globalization does not unfold over a level playing field. So the question is, does a global economy imply a diminished role on the part of the state? Globalization certainly does not mean an eclipse state. The idea of liberalization has often been linked with the notion of declining involvement of the state, particularly in matters pertaining to economic decision making. The idea of the minimalist state seems to suggest that the state should not intervene directly in the activities of private producers. However, in no sense does globalization imply universalism. In fact, globalization is a process which has found to exercise different impacts across regions and countries of the world. Not only that, even within individual countries, particularly large countries, the process of globalization or integration of the world economy has entailed different levels of development across the region. This could not be more true than in the case of India. This is clearly borne out by different levels of growth attained by the different states across India's federal polity. Under the circumstances, an important role on part of the state can hardly be precluded. So, what exactly is the role of the state in an era of globalization? Bahaduri and Nair comment that indeed danger and opportunity are so intricately intermingled in the liberalization of the Indian economy that the journey to the promised land of a well-functioning market economy could easily turn into a hellish nightmare of poverty and widening inequality for the majority of the population. The state, under the circumstances, will have to intervene, and positively at that. For the rewards of globalization are not likely to accrue to diverse segments of the Indian population, particularly those who are not sufficiently equipped to utilize the opportunities which are unfolding in a globalizing world. But it will be the responsibility of the electorate articulating itself through various civil society organizations and myriad channels to ensure this role on part of the state. After all, democracy makes sense only if the state responds to such public demands. Therefore, we see that the state emerges, even in a globalizing world, as a manager and a facilitator of globalization. In case of countries like India, the role of the state, far from approximating any sort of minimalism, seems to have got all the more buttressed for at least two reasons. First, the state as a manager or facilitator of globalization needs to initiate complementary institutional changes in the realms of policy, law, regulations, to ensure that the stakeholders involved in various trades and professions are able to enhance their capacity to cope with the increasingly competitive milieu that is ushered in by a globalizing world. And that is what requires the introduction of various safety nets like insurance schemes, infrastructure inputs like access to markets, credit facilities, and the like. And that is why the state needs to be a manager or a facilitator of globalization. On the other hand, there also remains the welfare commitment, which has not been abandoned under any circumstance. The state has to reaffirm and renew its commitment to people's welfare and pro-poor development. In fact, scholars like Bhagwati have emphasized the active role of the state as both a manager and as an agent of globalization. And that is why he says that the story of globalization today must be written in two wings, one colored by technical change. Globalization is certainly technology-driven, but it is also state-driven. And in that sense, state action is under no circumstances undermined, still less precluded. Clearly, therefore, the conclusion is undeniable. The state, the nation state, is here to stay. I would like to, in conclusion, stress the four basic pillars which try to sustain and which in fact ensure the durability and the continuity of the nation state, even in an age of globalization, where so much has been alluded to the concept of a borderless world. And that is what I begin with. First, exploding the myth of a borderless world. True, the concept of the borderless world is not irrelevant because that tries to draw attention to the fact that there has been an intensification of worldwide interconnectedness. Messages, information, cultural inputs flow from one country to another almost seamlessly. You will find there are various connectivity initiatives taking place across the world. Even in our side of the planet, we find that there are connectivity drives like the BBIN, which tries to ensure seamless movement of passengers and goods across countries in the South Asian region, from India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. The image that the world politics is dominated by transnational processes that elude state control, therefore, is an exaggeration. For example, national economies have not simply been absorbed in a borderless global economy, because much more economic activity continues to take place within state borders, and that is why we say that the whole idea of a borderless world is a myth. Even during the pandemic, we found that the state was such a dominant actor which had to play a leading role to deal with the crisis, as with other countries of the world. And that is why we come to the second important argument. States still remain the dominant players. We still live in a state-centric world. The realist position does remain unchallenged in that sense. Although states are merely one actor amongst many on the world stage, they are definitely the single most important players. States exercise power in a way and to an extent that no other actor can. In particular, using the administrative processes of government and relying on unchallengeable coercive power, their control over what happens within their territories remains unchallenged. The third is something we have already harped on, the notion of pooled sovereignty. There are various problems surfacing in the contemporary world which states find impossible to deal with single-handedly, and yet they are real problems. Problems like terrorism, climate change, problems pertaining to use of resources, environment, etc. And that is why the notion of pooled sovereignty, whereby states undertake to hold hands among themselves in order to address these common challenges, staring into the face of human civilization. And that is why the notion of pooled sovereignty. And finally, we find that there is enduring attraction of the nation state. There seems little likelihood that states will lose their dominance as long as they continue to enjoy the allegiance of the mass of their citizens. We can't think of any other organization which can impregnate such huge masses of population with a common identity and unite them. As most states are nation states, this is ensured by the survival of nationalism as the world's most potent ideological force, which can hardly be denied. Look at cricket matches that take place between countries, and you will see the reality of nationalism very well. So rival doctrines such as cosmopolitanism and allegiances based, for instance, on religion, culture, or ethnicity are of minor significance compared with the force of nationalism. All these put together help us to understand how the nation state, far from getting eclipsed, is in a dominant role even in a globalized world. Thank you.